Wendy Wilson Fall, born in Washington, D.C. on November 12th, 1952, which means I will soon be 70 years old.
Very nice. So let's start from the beginning. And you are a native of Washington,
Yes.
D.C., and it would be nice if you could just share what childhood was like.
Um,
growing up in this.
Well, I think of my childhood in phases, as I guess a lot of people do because of my family moving. So the first part of my childhood was living on Howard's campus, where I trailed after my older brother as we walked to Mott Elementary School. And I remember the college students looking so old to me at the time. And then we moved to Northwest Washington, not too far from Tacoma Park. That was really a great period of my life. I think a great period of family life in general. We were all very involved in aspects of what my father did professionally, which was he was Dean of Foreign Students at Howard. So my childhood, actually part of my childhood was split between trying to be cool, or what they call in DC, fly, and on the other hand, going to the Embassy of Mali and the Embassy of Guinea and watching movies of the Ballet Africain with my friends who were the daughters of African ambassadors. And I started doing that when I was 9. So it's really an integral part of me. And also at the same time, my mother's sister, Sheila, was majoring in Spanish. And her friend, who had already graduated, ended up being my Spanish teacher. And I had an uncle who had married a Puerto Rican. So when I would come home from school, my aunt would be there with my teacher, and they would say, Wendy, speak in Spanish. Don't speak English, speak Spanish. So I think 9 years old was a time of, I really started absorbing a lot of different influences.
And so what was it like going to these embassies? Did you meet, were there children there your age?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was such an education. First of all, we didn't often see the ambassador or his wife because they were busy doing other things, but there were always, as is typical, an extended family, African family, uncles, older cousins, older brothers and sisters watching over us. And basically we would go listen to music. I think we were listening to soul music at the time. And then we would go upstairs and raid the kitchen, and we would have these huge rice dishes. And then we would go back. But there was also this in and out of other cultural currents, like learning how to wear the clothing, or being exposed to these different fabrics that people wore, the colors, speaking French, hearing people speak other languages. That was also integrated into that experience, yeah.
And what was it like? So you lived on Howard University for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that world like for you? Meaning, what was the day-to-day?
Oh, well, we left when I was 5, so I don't really remember. And actually, I have a very silly little child's memory of my socks falling down in my shoes and being annoyed that everybody kept walking and I had to stop to pull up my socks. But even after we moved, of course, I was often at Howard to go see my father about something. And what I remember, and also because he had these events called International Night, when all the different students would do something from their country. And I remember enjoying the reliable formality of things. So you had to say hello to people. You had to greet them politely. And even if I were walking across the campus, a lot of the administrators and professors knew my father. And so they would stop me and say, "Aren't you Ernie Wilson's daughter?" And I would say, "Yes." I mean, this was what was expected. You were expected to be polite and to say who you were and so forth. So that was a big part of it.
And Washington, D.C. at that time, especially in the areas that you grew up, was it pretty much a black community?
Yes, pretty much a black community.
For someone who doesn't know, what was that community like?
You know, I think it's very hard for people now to understand what that was like. It was really like being from a Caribbean country in many ways when I look back at it, because you simply did not see people who weren't black. They were so much on the fringe of your existence. They were not, maybe they were crucial in subterranean ways that we didn't know, but I only knew a few white people, and they were Jewish. One had the store in our neighborhood, and then there was a family who were friends of my parents, and that was it. And sometimes it's embarrassing to think of how we talked about white people, because it was like they were from Mars or something. You know, like what they dressed like, and what their bodies were like, and what they smelled like, half of which was conjecture. We didn't know. But it was like a foreign land. And, but it wasn't mean. You know what I mean? It wasn't snarky. It wasn't mean. It was actually a very innocent kind of, wow, the people on the other side of the mountain, we don't know, you know? And there was a lot of freedom because we went from house to house. D.C. was always a party town. It wasn't a nightclub town until recently. But in the black community, it was house parties, going from house to house, and parents knowing who you were, where you were going, even during the day. And that was the big feature of the black D.C. that I grew up in.
Parents really have to know exactly where
Oh
you
yeah,
went,
especially my parents. Ooh. My parents were not playing. Mm-mm.
So you finished school, meaning K through 12 in D.C.
Yes.
And that was a pretty much an all-black experience, or?
Yes. In fact, I skipped 2 grades. I skipped a grade in junior high, and I skipped a grade in high school. But there were still a few white people in my high school that we were friends with, along with my older brother, Ernie. So we had, I guess, a little crowd in that neighborhood where we hung out and knew each other. Bobby knew the same people. And I also took Robert O'Mealy, and I also took art classes at the Corcoran Gallery with a friend who was white American, who's actually Scandinavian American, if you like. So.
So high school there were white students.
Yeah, there were still a few. Yes. More white teachers, yeah.
I see. What was it being introduced to whites in that way? Were you conscious of that?
Like the teachers, you mean?
Yes.
They were just like, I guess that's what Peace Corps volunteers look like to people in an African village. Oh, here's our white person, you know. Well, you know, and I've been close enough to those situations where people will actually express things like that. Oh, this is our American, or this is our white person.
Okay.
I think we just thought of, oh, this is our nice white person. So, yeah, I don't think we had many undesirable or strange acting teachers at the time. Yeah.
And then what happened after high school?
Oh my. Well, you see, the last year of high school for me was the year that Martin Luther King was killed. I had a very strange high school experience because in the 11th grade, or what would have been the 11th grade, I guess, I was an intern at a place called the New School of Afro-American Thought, which was at 14th and almost 14th and U. And it was near what later became famous as Ben's Chili Bowl. And that place was this sort of effervescence of black nationalists. And there was, what was his name? There was a poet named Gaston Neal, this African-American poet. There were people, they played jazz all the time. And so the younger people like myself, we were just sort of hanging around, feeling cool, and oh God, we're just being steeped in this black jazz culture. And people were very nationalist, and this is when people were debating whether Swahili should be learned, and looking at the map of Africa. And then Stokely came to town, Kwame Ture. I met him, I met Rap Brown, I met Sam Otu, I met all these people. And then Stokely, AKA Kwame Ture, used to give these talks to the kids. And he had a tendency of repeating a phrase. So he would always say, what I want you to learn is an undying love for your people, an undying love for your people, an undying love for your people. And that repetition, we all felt such a sense of mission and purpose. So his teachings were not about violence. His teachings were about dedication and commitment and organizing. So that's what I was doing when I was in high school. Also doing artwork, painting, and then I became the vice president of the Black Student Union for all of Washington, D.C. Oh my goodness. And we had this big thing when Martin Luther King was killed. Oh my goodness, that was crazy.
Can you describe that?
Whew, that was terrible. Well, first of all, it was a moment of such, to say it in very simple terms, of such unfairness. You had Malcolm X. Everybody knew Martin Luther King was trying to be civilized and peaceful. So for him to be killed really upped the ante, and it really reframed everything. And then of course there were the riots, and my parents wouldn't let me out the house. But I had lots of friends who were in the riots. We didn't have cell phones, so they kept stopping by the house with news reports.
Were the riots in a particular area?
Yes, they were.
Was it Adamsburg? What?
7th Street,
7th Street. Okay.
U Street, where that new school of Afro, all the way up to 14th, like between N or M up to about, not quite Columbia Road, what's that street? I forget where the park is, Meridian Hill Park.
16th Street?
Yeah, but the cross street, Euclid.
Oh, Euclid, yes, yes.
So like Euclid down to M, and then 7th over to 14th.
Okay, so that, and your parents, of course, were very concerned that you...
Yeah, they were not going to let me out. But people stopped by, and they, you know, people were stealing things. But we felt like an occupied, we were an occupied country. You know, that the army came to my neighborhood. And that's why when people were talking about George Floyd, I was like, hey, this is the first time. When I was in high school, the army set up in my high school field.
Why?
Because they deployed the army in different neighborhoods in Washington.
This was, now you're talking about the same time?
Yes, like 3 days later.
Okay.
And they were walking around with their guns and their fatigues.
Was this the National Guard?
Yes, I guess. I don't know. And they had these big helicopters with spotlights, so it was very terrorizing. They would go around the neighborhood, and these big spotlights would come down. And, you know, those spotlights are coming down on everybody. They're not just coming down on 16-year-old guys who might cause trouble. You know, yeah, that was for like almost a month. And sometimes we would talk to the Army guys and say, don't you all feel bad? Why are you doing this? You know, you're on the wrong side. You know, we'd say things like that. But we were really occupied. It was really, you know what, my father was so political. And I remember before they killed Martin Luther King, looking at TV and my father saying, uh-oh, now he's going after international labor. He's talking to the garbage workers, and he's talking about international labor, and they're not going to forgive him that. It's over. My father said that. He said, he's in trouble now. Now he's talking about international labor. The party's over. And it happened.
And so you were very much involved with, you said, with the student, but
Yes.
Can you describe that?
Oh, it was exhilarating.
Did you form that, or?
No, I think Stokely and SNCC came to town, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, came to town, and that was part of their strategy. And I think it was in several different cities. Cleveland Sellers, who's down in South Carolina, he was around at the time. So that was part of their strategy. They had a youth strategy. And so they helped the students create these meetings. And most of the meetings were really lessons. They were like history lessons. Black people didn't know very much about their own history, or about their relationship to Africa, or even their relationship to colonial America. None of that.
So this organization got, in other words, it was formed under your, well, how old were you then?
Oh gosh, 15.
15. Wow.
So they created it, and then they called meetings, and the kids from that part of the city would be at the meetings. I don't even remember. I guess I got voted in. I don't really remember. And then another guy that I knew, Dale Ashton, became the president. And then there we were. So we would go to these meetings and have sort of political education.
Wonderful. And was part of your responsibility to try to bring other young blacks into the...
Yes, but primarily I think we were there as like a communication network.
Okay, I see.
So that if there was another meeting, or there was, at that time people were demonstrating very much at the Embassy of South Africa. So
Was it then on Massachusetts?
yes, yes.
Oh,
Oh yeah, that was a big deal. There was a lot of focus on the Embassy of Mickey, I forget his last name, he was an organizer, was very involved with that. So we would support those types of demonstrations as well.
So you were 15.
I was 15.
And then you've been moved up a couple of grades. So when did you graduate from high school?
When I was 16.
16. So then what happened?
Then I went to Howard,
Okay.
to the art department. I really intended to be a
Tell us
professional.
about your interest in art.
Yeah, I really meant to be a professional artist. I guess somewhere in there I still am.
What did oil? What was that?
I did printmaking mostly, intaglio and etching, and some painting. But I studied under, I was so lucky I was there with all the greats. Skender Bokhassian from Ethiopia, Ed Love, Ed Smith, Lois Mailou Jones, Huey Smith. Man, I got to know everybody. They were my everyday people. And of course, at the same time was, what's the dancer who has her own school now in LA, who was at Howard? She was there, whose sister played with Bill Cosby.
Yes.
She was there at the same time. We were all there. So how lucky we were. We had teachers who really cared about us. we would stay late at night. They would leave the studios open. Lila Asher was also one of the professors. And they would play jazz. They'd be playing John Coltrane, and we'd be in the studios feeling so grown and hip and doing our artwork. You know, it was how lucky. We didn't even know how lucky we were. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to do. And I studied very seriously, and I was in exhibits right from the beginning. I sold artwork right from the beginning. And I came under the tutelage of a woman named Texira Nash, who's a very famous Washingtonian who passed away, unfortunately, about 25 years ago, whose father was Cape Verdean, and whose mother was what I call historic African American. And she was a very important person in the art scene in Black Washington. And she was sort of a liaison between the Black community and the endowment for the arts and all of that. She was a very busy, talented person and an artist. So she was one of my mentors, because she was sort of in between myself and my parents. She was younger, you know, so. And that was a very fortunate time. But then I think a theme that has recurred regularly throughout my life is my being torn between here and overseas.
So you went to Howard?
I went to Howard.
Art.
I studied art. Graduated cum laude.
Your artwork was sold, it was displayed?
It was in galleries.
Where? Beyond D.C.?
Oh, yeah.
New
I
York?
was in a group show in Mexico. I was in a group show in New York. It's a group show in Washington. My work is in people's houses right now here in D.C. and elsewhere.
So you really had an amazing career.
Oh, yeah, and I continued it in New York.
Okay.
So
After you graduated from Howard,
I went to New York.
you went to New York.
Because getting back to the Gregories,
Yes.
the
Gregories being
my mother's maternal family,
your maternal family, yes.
there was a guy named Jimmy Hinton. He was a Black photographer.
Jimmy
Hinton, very famous Black photographer, who was from Atlantic City, which is where my mother's family lived. And I was looking for a job, and somehow Jimmy Hinton was in touch with my father and said, you know, she should go up to New York because Betty Blayton Taylor, who is another really important, famous personage in the Black art world, is looking for an administrative assistant because she has something called the Children's Art Carnival, which still exists, which was funded by the Museum of Modern Art and the Rockefellers. So I got on a bus and I went to Betty Blayton Taylor's house and sat down and talked with Betty Blayton Taylor and ended up with the job. So I lived with my Uncle Hugh, which is my mother's brother, for about a year and a half before I got my own place. And I met Romare Bearden. I met all these other, I was a member of Bob Blackbird's printmaking workshop on, what's that part of New York called? I forget, like around 23rd and 8th Avenue. Still a very famous place. I really had, Chelsea, I had a great time. I mean, I got to know Quincy Troop. I got to know so many crazy people in New York. I had a fabulous time. And in the jazz world, in the literary world, in the art world, you know, I was hanging out and going to exhibits and receptions and so forth.
What was New York like in terms of the black-white? I'm sorry to put it that way.
Yes.
I'm just curious.
Well, you know, New York has always been particular.
Yes.
Right from its beginning, which, I mean, I only know that because that is part of African American history, I know. New York has always been particular. It's not, there hasn't been oppression, repression, meanness, conflict, and treachery. But black people have been in New York from the very beginning. And because of the Dutch.
Could you speak about that?
Yes, because the Dutch were the first slave traders. Well, the Portuguese were the first.
Yes.
But the Dutch came right after the Portuguese. And the Dutch bought, of course, New York. And I ended up doing a lot of research on this, actually, for one of my projects. And they also owned a couple of islands in the Caribbean. So I was looking at the Dutch because they brought people from Madagascar, which I was doing research about. But their laws were different from the British, and their laws were not as repressive as the British laws, believe it or not. And so a lot of the Africans who were in New York or upstate New York, Creepy Hollow and all those places around there, were Dutch people and Africans. And what happened is that when the Irish came in, the Irish and the black people lived together. They partied like dogs. They partied all the time. They made hooch, illegal liquor together. I mean, if you look at the records, they had the same diseases. They lived in the same apartment buildings. And then the British said, oh, no, we can't have this. This is absolutely out of the question. We are not going to have this. Because I'm sure they were facing the same problem in places like Jamaica, where, you know, you had working class Irish, some of whom were overseers, but others who were having children with the Africans. So, yeah, that's the story with the Dutch. Oh, they changed the laws. They separated everybody out and made everything illegal. So New York has a very unique history of black mobility. In fact, black people used to perform down at the port and really do what is a precursor to hip hop, to rap. They used to make these little political commentaries and for fish. So they would dance and they would do these gestures, which were really like rap music, and make political commentaries about what was going on in New York. And blacks have always had this special position in American society where they're in it, but they're not in it. So they can say things that the white people are afraid to say. The white people want them to say it, but they imagine that they can't afford to say it. So even then, in the 1600s and the early 1700s, that was happening at Catherine Slip in New York. And the black people would make, this was before blackface, this was before all of that, and they would make these comments, and the whites, the Irish would all crowd around them and cheer them on and clap. And so...
There's a cemetery.
Yes.
In New York, African American. Does that go back to?
Yes. Near Wall Street.
Yes, exactly.
That's what the wall was for. In fact, that's a great person to talk to, Michael Blakey. He went to high school with me, and he directed that project. He's been a professor at William and Mary. He's an physical anthropologist.
So is that population who's buried there, does that go back to the Dutch?
Yes.
I thought so. Okay,
Yes.
so, and the wall, you said, why is the wall there?
To separate the black people from everybody
So
else.
that was, okay, I see.
Isn't that something? It's you know, it's so unfortunate the way Americans understand their history. Some things just are. You know, just calm down. It already happened, but it's good to know about it. You know, people think it's some kind of a aggressiveness or meanness. No, I mean, if somebody teaches me about Caesar, are they being aggressive to me? No, it's just the story of Caesar. So anyway, New York has always been that. And then New York has a large Afro-Caribbean population. It had then a growing number of Puerto Ricans. So I experienced New York in that very multicultural way. I still spoke Spanish. And I lived on the West Side. I lived on Manhattan Avenue. So eventually, first I lived, believe it or not, I lived in the Barbizon across from the Museum of Natural History for about 6 months. And then I moved and got this apartment on Manhattan Avenue. Well, I have to tell you about the Barbizon. The reason I laugh is there's this little white lady who lived there. I don't know how old she was, but she loved feather boas. And every morning she would come downstairs with, so New York, with another big feather boa. They'd be bright colors like goldenrod yellow or turquoise. She was very friendly. I enjoyed it because I could go to the museum when I wanted to. I loved the West Side. I loved walking around the West Side. But let me just say this. Camille Billups and Faith Ringgold are two very famous African-American women artists. And they were my ideals. The thing is that in those days, as a young black artist, you did not make it. The white people went to the older black people. There was no such thing as you just going to a gallery by yourself and trying to get established. The world, it was so small. I mean, I'm surprised I never met Basquiat, but I never met Basquiat. But the world was so small that if you were a promising young artist and say you went to an opening and somebody said, I heard about you, I saw some slides, they would go to the older men and ask them, is that somebody worth backing? So they were the gatekeepers. That's what eventually turned me off. Not Bearden so much as like Norman, what's his name? Norman Lewis, I think his name was. Yeah, people like that. And they had this really old-fashioned, really 19th century point of view of the art world, that you should suffer, that you should go almost crazy, you should perhaps become an alcoholic or, pull your hair out or, So when a young black artist was coming up, first of all, they did not support them charging too much for their work. And they would tell people, don't pay them that. The person's too young. Or they would say, they're not ready for that gallery scene yet.
So you were a part of this
Yeah.
scheme?
I was part of that milieu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how long did you stay in New York City?
3 or 4 years. Then I started thinking about going back to Africa.
So was that but you had mentioned before that you were thinking about overseas.
Yeah, I missed it.
When did you go overseas first?
Oh, I forgot to mention.
Yeah.
Also through my parents and our neighborhood. They were involved in something called Operation Crossroads Africa. And this was an unusual year when they were going to send high school students to Africa. And everybody knew my father was like a really avid Pan-Africanist and loved Africa at a time when if you said Africa, most people giggled or left the room because they were so embarrassed by even the idea of Africa. Americans really have a terrible problem with Africa. It's Achilles heel. But anyway, so...
Are we talking America?
Yes,
in general?
yes.
Everyone?
Yes.
Including the
In
blacks?
in my humble opinion.
Including the blacks?
Yes. It's like the site of a wound that has not been cleaned out. But anyway, so we had to walk and get sponsors, and because it was a fundraiser. So you walked and you got as many people as possible to give money for each mile that you walked, and then you could go on this trip to Africa. So I went along with a couple of friends, 16.
Okay.
And my friend Marianne French went. She went to, I think, where did she go? Niger. Mm-hmm. And I ended up going to northern Liberia near Guinea. It was so fabulous. And of course it was before there were a lot of black Americans going to West Africa. So they never quite knew what to make of us or who we were, like, do these people have an ethnicity that we should know about, So like when we were in the village, certain things, there was also a Afro-Caribbean woman there. There are things they wouldn't let us do because they said in their village the women didn't do it. And since they didn't know our heritage, they were going to play it safe. They didn't want the ancestors to get angry. They would prefer that we just not do certain things. But I got to go to the farm, in most of Africa, especially West Africa, whoever you are. if you're young and you go to a village, they're going to assign you parents. So I had a mother, and I learned how to go to the farm with her. She showed me how to fan rice,
Oh, yes, yes.
and she showed me how to pound rice. And it was a wonderful experience. I learned how to carry things on my head. And, yeah, so I had that experience.
The language?
A little bit. That language was called Mano, which is close to Mandinka. It's like a subset. So anyway, there I was in New York, and I started thinking, man, I want to. And plus, I had some friends from West Africa. They were making me miss West Africa even more. So, yeah, I decided I could go for my master's. And I just went into Chemical Bank one day and said, I need a loan. I don't know where I got these ideas. But I knew that there were educational loans. So I went into the bank and I said, I want to get my master's and I need a student loan. I was lucky because I got a black bank officer. You see how these things matter? We don't see all those different little turns that could make a difference in a young black person's life. I could have had a white person who laughed me out of the bank. Or I could have had a white Peace Corps volunteer who would have helped. But I mean, you know, it matters. So anyhow, he said, okay, what school are you going to? I said, I'm going to do Bello University in northern Nigeria. He was like, what? But, because I really wanted...
Have you investigated this?
Yes. I really wanted to go to Mali because I had been going to the embassy of Mali, remember when I was little? But I was very fascinated by the tenacity of Muslim communities in West Africa. Unlike people who were proselytized for Christianity, the Muslims would not budge. They were very secure in their history. And so there was always a tug of war with the French. They didn't want to go to the French schools. They didn't care anything about anything. They felt like they were already civilized. So I really found that so interesting. And but I didn't think I could go for my master's in French. So that's how I chose northern Nigeria. Yeah.
So you got the loan?
I got the loan.
And you went?
And I went. And
what was the reaction of the family?
well, as fate would have it, my older brother, Ernie, was going to Nigeria to do his dissertation research.
Perfect.
Perfect. So he went to Lagos, and I went up north to Zaria. And then I continued my research on the Fulani people because I had been learning Fulani from my Sierra Leonean Guinean friends here in Washington, D.C.
Tell us about the Fulani, just briefly.
Oh, the Fulani are an ethnic group in West Africa who are known for, their rural populations who are livestock, very important livestock producers, cattle producers. They also made up a very big portion of the Muslim intelligentsia all over West Africa. And they are a diaspora, so they're all over West Africa. And of course now we're finding all kind of research about people named Omar and others who were most Fulanis. Even Yero Mahmoud was here in Washington, D.C. in the 1800s. I met this young guy who was in my father's office, who was from Sierra Leone, turned out to be actually really from Guinea. And I started hanging out with him and his fiance, who was from there also, and hanging out at their house. This is always a sort of double thing I was doing. This is also while I was at Howard. And they started teaching me the language. And I would go to parties with them, and I looked something like his sister. So people thought I was one of their relatives, and we would play jokes on people. They would say, shh, don't say anything, just come with us. So So I would just come with him and sit at the party like this, and people would come and ask him, can I dance with her? They thought I was his cousin from Guinea. And then just to make, I would say a few words in French, and people say, oh, okay. So that's how I first got interested in that. Yeah.
Learned French.
Yes, my brother and I, Ernie, because my father spoke a little French. And then we were going to the embassies of Mali and mostly Mali and Cameroon. And we spoke French there, and we hung out at these crazy, that's what I was telling Malik, we went to these parties around here, these crazy junior diplomat parties, so to speak.
What was Africa like?
I don't know, part of it must be personality, personal disposition, and who knows what else, but I had already been exposed to people from Africa here in D.C., so I just knew they were people. They weren't like the Africans. They were just these, with whom I knew I shared some cultural affinity. I didn't feel like I have to be African or I have to prove I'm African, because I'm already African American. We always see these negative images of Africa. I mostly know West Africa, but people love children in West Africa. So when you're a young person in West Africa, you immediately have all these people who care about you and who also will discipline you. Like if you walk down the street with the wrong thing on, or you talk too loud, somebody will poke their head out of nowhere, like in the south of the United States, and say, what are you doing? What did you... So let's see, when I was there, I was in that village, and then I came back. And then I went back to Ahmadu Bello University, and I lived in the girls' dormitory. I had a very good friend who passed away about 4 years ago, named Ladi Y. And Ladi's father was from Chad, and her mother was from northern Nigeria. And she took me under her wing. We lived in Queen Amina dormitory. And of course, gender, how can I put this? Gender solidarity is very important in Africa. I don't know how much people can understand it. It really has nothing to do with your sex life. Nobody even wants to know about your sex life. In fact, nobody even talks about sex of any kind. But gender is important. So living in the dormitory, we cook together, people come and get each other. I'm cooking a special fish dish, come to my room. They took me to the market with them. How do you comport yourself at the market? How do you get people to help you at the market? How do you learn to be polite in the market? How do you learn to be respected? But there's a lot of a lot of female solidarity. A lot. Whether people are Muslim or Christian or anything. Has nothing to do with sex.
And I think this is a very hard thing sometimes to explain. I can relate to this, being a Middle Easterner.
Yeah.
And seeing how the women in the culture I come from
also
have this.
So much solidarity.
Oh, it's amazing.
And it's like they have their own jokes. They sit around and insult men. They tell terrible stories. They make strategies. They share their sorrows. They plot weddings.
It's an amazing support system.
Yes, so I loved it. That's how I experienced it. I did have 2 American friends who lived in that area, and I'm still friends with one of them very much. So I was there for 3 years, yeah.
So you got your master's?
I got my master's.
In
Sociology and art and graphics, double. They didn't have that
How
before.
was it going to university there?
It was good. The dean, Solomon Wangboji was his name, in case any Nigerians ever see this. It was formal. It There are times when you had to show up and be in class and be serious, no joking, take your notes. It was a British system.
It was a British system.
I had an American woman who was my professor in sociology. So I would meet with her like once every 2 weeks. But my best friends were the people in Ag Extension, because I was doing a kind of an encyclopedia of Fulani tattoos and geographic movement. So they assigned this older gentleman to me who was an Ag Extension worker. And he would come pick me up at 8:30 in the morning with his little motorcycle and put me on the back and take me out about 100 kilometers to this Fulani village and leave me there for the rest of the day. He'd come back and get me around 5. And that's what I did for like a year and a half. I would just go there.
And what were you doing?
Well, to be honest, sometimes I was sleeping because they made yogurt and they would give me the yogurt and then I would just, I stayed in their little huts.
But you really learned about.
Yes. And I learned the language very well. I knew when the cows went out. I knew when they were coming back. I learned how to carry myself. I got my tattoo, my Fulani tattoo.
What's the significance of a Fulani tattoo?
Well, there are two kinds. Some are decorative, like this one. It's just, but this one is actually from a region in Niger and Nigeria, Katsina. So this is a symbol of Katsina. It's a crocodile. But they also have facial tattoos. And those facial tattoos show their clan. And clans from a particular area wear a particular tattoo. But it's not really required. It's more just sort of like custom. But I actually ended up doing, finally, an article for African Arts about those tattoos and why people do them.
So you were there for 3 years.
Yeah.
You would go to this village.
Yes.
And then you finished your master's degree.
Yes.
And then what happened?
Then I came, and then I spoke Hausa, because they speak Hausa in northern Nigeria.
So you now know how many. Was your second language Spanish?
Yes.
Okay, then you learned
French.
Then
Okay, let me see. Spanish, French, Fulani, Hausa.
okay.
And so I came back to the U.S. and I'm looking around for a job. I can't find a job. And so I went up to the Howard University African Studies program and I said, I'm looking for a job. Would you like somebody to teach Hausa? Oh my goodness. But fortunately for me, the people there said no, but we have something called the Foreign Language FLAS program for students to learn foreign languages. Perhaps you could learn a language that is related to Hausa. So I thought, well, so I studied Arabic. 2 years of Arabic, 5 days a week. Yeah, 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, Arabic. Arabic. Till I was dreaming in Arabic. Yeah, so I, what happened is I went into the doctoral program because I literally said, well, if you don't have a job, you have this program, how much do they give you a month? And I'm ashamed to think that's what I said. How much money would I get a month? And so that's what I did. Then I went into the doctoral program and in African Studies.
African Studies at Howard?
At Howard.
Okay.
But I was very lucky because I had a professor named John Van Dusen Lewis, this white anthropologist who had just come out of Yale, who was at AID. And of course, Suleiman Yang, a very famous Gambian scholar who was here in Washington, D.C., so I had a lot of wonder people around me. Bai Cham, also at Howard. Had a lot of African professors.
Who was that?
He's a Gambian who specialized in filmmaking.
Okay.
So that's what I did. I had great courses. I worked really hard.
Did you ever teach Arabic?
No. Well, what I did after that, so I started doing consulting. What was it? PhD. For a while, no.
So you took Arabic,
Yeah.
got your PhD in
Well, I finished my coursework
your coursework in African
in
American
African studies
African studies. Okay.
with a concentration in anthropology.
Okay. Oh.
And then I think what happened is I started shopping for a way to go do my field work. So I got a National Science Foundation grant, but it wasn't enough money. So I was like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? This is not enough money, I'll never survive. So I followed my dissertation advisor up to AID and just followed him like a puppy or something. Just telling people, Niger, hi, my name is Wendy, I'm trying to go to Niger. And I finally got something they called in those days a host country contract, which meant that you were working as if you were from the local population. You got good money, but it wasn't like the money that the American experts got. And then I went to Niger for 3 years.
And did your field study?
I did my field study there in Niger. That was on resource management, national resource management and social position. So I looked at, it was so interesting. I looked at these 2 different Fulani villages and caste in the villages. So there, some of the neighborhoods, the way things work there is that you have a village and there's going to be a neighborhood, if you will, of that village of people of slave origin. And they live in that neighborhood. And so this is very pronounced, especially among some Fulani groups. So, and there's some very nuanced things about identity that happen. Everybody is Fulani, but people have different, and then there's sort of there's a middle tier where you're of casted origin, but you're also related to the elites. So you're like a different type of person. And that was what I did my research on. And it was, this is the other thing that's interesting, especially to me as African American, that made it interesting to me, is that while the liberation of slaves, wherever it happened, was good, it was different from the prior system, because in the prior systems, the non-Western systems, there was sort of a trickle-up program. No matter who you were, you're slowly trickling up from slave identity. You see, nobody was frozen, because you could have slave identity, say that your grandfather was a captive, but then your aunt married the chief's younger brother. So then you gain that whole family network. Once they stopped slavery, people didn't have that anymore. So they just got frozen into those, a very flat kind of,
So it became a caste.
yeah. Well, they had castes anyway.
They had it anyway.
But then you're frozen in a very,
Then you're frozen.
yeah. So some people migrated out to other communities, but since, they just became a different ethnic group, which people couldn't do here in America. In Africa, you could be from a slave ethnic group and say, you know what? I'm going to leave and go to another place and I'm going to become something else. And then you just make up a story for yourself. You make up a history and you join another community and you become a Hausa person, So, so I feel like I learned a lot of really important social principles in that research.
And did you publish?
Yeah, I published several articles. I never did publish a book about it. Why not? I think that I became so close to so many Fulani communities that there was something disgusting about writing a book about them. I couldn't bring myself. All these years, I have not been able to do that, you know, because I've met different communities of Fulani people, and
So, were you in the Sahel?
yes,
Where?
Niger,
Oh, so you, okay, that's where.
yes,
Is this
all the way up to Agadez, near the desert.
Ah, what was that like?
Wonderful. I love it. I don't know why. Ernie always teases me. He says, "You're the only person I know who's happy when they get to the desert with a cup of tea."
That's right.
But I'm this person. Take me out to the arid place, put a rug or a blanket on the ground,
In your
make some tea, and give me some roast meat and some yogurt, and I'm ready to go.
did they have
That's that
dance?
culture, yes.
Dance?
That's the culture.
Yeah.
And I spent many, many, many nights listening to music. And they, of course, they are consummate conversationalists. Nomadic people, they are the best. It's an art. They can keep the conversation going forever.
How long were you there?
3 years,
And did you do
3.5
research,
years.
or was it just
Yes, I mean, that's where I still did the
That's where you
Fulani
did the
research,
Fulani, okay.
which was towards the south
So
of
you were-
Niger.
I see.
But then I would also go to other areas of
I see,
Niger.
okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Did your Arabic come in handy?
Sometimes, yes.
Right?
Yeah, it did.
In those, some of those
Yeah. Well, you know, that's a very interesting part of the world. In Niger, you have families who descend from the original Moroccan invasion of the Songhai Empire, and they are not, they know who they are. So they have certain family last names. They're from places like Timbuktu. Some of them even know where they were from in Spain. And over the centuries, they've intermarried with black Songhai families. Sometimes they send their daughters back to Algeria to get married, or to Morocco to keep these social networks open. It's very fascinating. It's amazing.
And so after you finished travels in that
Niger.
area, Niger and did your studies, you came back?
I came back.
And then what?
Then I did a few consultancies, and that's when I used my Arabic, because I got a consultancy in Egypt. I was there for 9 weeks, looking at cooperatives in the Delta. That was a lot. That was fabulous.
Did you do anything with the Nubian?
No, no. I was in Fayoum and Beni Suef and all these places.
This was, what year was this?
Like 90,
Oh, interesting. Time
maybe,
in Egypt.
yeah, late 80s, I think. And mid 80s, yeah, I enjoyed that. I really used, my Arabic was so good then, because I was using it a lot. And then I joined the African Development Foundation. Again, my father helped me out because I was applying, and I had worked over a summer for the Rainbow Coalition. And somebody called my father, and I'm not naming any names, somebody called my father and said, "Tell your daughter to take Rainbow Coalition off of her CV, because Washington, D.C. is changing, and she will never get a job if she shows that she worked." What was his name who went for president? Jesse Jackson. She will never get a job with that on her CV, because things are changing here in D.C. I think some people are looking at her CV, but she got to take that off. So I did. And I ended up with this job at the African Development Foundation. I created a unit for the Sahel, because at that time they just had West Africa. I'm so loyal. I was loyal to my Sahelians. It's like, we can't just mix with West Africa. Are you kidding me? So we had the Sahel region that was Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. And I was there for 5 years.
It's so interesting how sometimes Africa just, people just think it's all the same. And yet
Yes.
it is the most diverse continent.
Yes.
And the largest, I think.
Yes, yeah,
But this tendency to just think that it's all the same.
yes.
Yet it just is not. I mean,
No.
it's anything.
I was so lucky and blessed. So blessed, because you know, all of us who were there in that first generation, working under Leonard Robinson, who was the president, and Percy Wilson was the vice president. We had so much energy. We were young and feisty, and I traveled 3 or 4 times a year, 4 to 6 weeks per trip to West Africa. I would go to Dulles, Paris, Bamako, Dakar, Paris, Dakar, Bamako, Niamey, Paris, Niamey, Bamako. I traveled so much that I started seeing my friends from Niger in the airports. And I traveled so much that people at Charles de Gaulle thought I lived in Paris.
What did you do during these trips? What was
It was insane.
like Paris and other places?
Well, I would stop. I had friends who lived in Paris.
Okay.
So I would stop and they would meet me and I'd go spend 2 days with them. And my favorite thing was to stay at the Hotel Claude Bernard, which Ernie also knows, because it's on the same street with Présence Africaine and Cahiers des Études Africaines. So my favorite was to stay at that hotel and then get up in the morning and go to the bookstores. But
So you traveled and you were involved in...
I would stay in a hotel.
Yes.
So it was a lot of logistics that we had to get together. You'd get your hotel, and then we received by mail, believe it or not, all these applications, because there's a limit to how much we could fund. We had a $250,000 limit. So you would go for an informational tour and tell people, I'm going to be back, write a proposal, maybe we can help your village or your NGO or whoever. And then they would start sending the stuff, and then we had to analyze the different applications, then choose the ones that we were going to follow up. Then you'd have a dossier of maybe 8 or 9 projects, and off you would go back. And then you'd go back to the hotel, and you would have, at first we didn't even have assistants. You would have people coming 10 to 11, 12 to 1, 3 to 4, all the way to 8 o'clock at night, going over applications in the lobby or maybe a room on the side or something. Then you'd go back and fight.
And then fund.
Yeah, you'd fight for the money. You'd fight.
Or different proposals.
Defend your proposal and fight for why you thought that particular proposal should be funded.
This was through the USAID?
It is a sister agency to AID.
Okay.
It's more like the Inter-American Foundation. It still exists,
But that
it,
must have been rewarding.
oh, it was very rewarding. I got to go places that most people couldn't go to. As you said, Africa's big. The distances are enormous in the Sahel. You know, from Dakar to the Mali border is 1,000 miles. I mean, so normally you wouldn't even have the money to go visit these places. And I got to know a lot of the Tamashek, the Berber, the Tuaregs, a lot of them. I knew a lot of them. I funded a lot of Tuareg projects in Mali and Niger. I visited a lot of farms. I learned a lot about rice, irrigation, and a lot of stuff about agriculture.
And then when that ended, what?
EDF. Well, then I started thinking, I think I was really burned out. I was so burned out. I couldn't even get on a bus. I had been traveling so much. And I had been married, and that didn't succeed very well with all that movement back and forth. And that's when I had my first son, Aziz. And yeah, I think what happened is my mother got sick. Let me see, I'm trying to think. My mother passed away. And then I had Aziz, who had traveled with me when I went to work for ADF. I put him in a very hoity-toity little private school near here called the Rock Creek School, which had mostly World Bank kids. But I wanted Aziz to keep French. So I put him in that school. I was working 3 jobs. I don't even know how I did it. I was teaching at UMBC. I was teaching 2 classes a week at Aziz's school to reduce the cost of the tuition. And then I was also teaching with a friend, doing teacher training about Africa. So I did that for a year. Like I said, I needed to be absorbed too, because I was sort of in mourning. And then, of course, I decided to go back to Africa. Yeah, my father passed away, what, 1.5 years after my mother passed away. I did a couple consultancies in between, going to Niger and Mali. And then I put myself on several different contracts to see, that's what you have to see, which one comes up. So I had Guinea, Madagascar, Senegal.
This was through the organization here, the contracts. Who?
They were firms.
Oh, firms. Oh, okay.
Firms here in Washington that I knew of, had met or worked with some of them. And I thought I was going to go to Guinea, but I ended up going to Senegal.
How was that?
Oh, I was a
You
snob.
would rather have gone to Guinea.
I really wanted to go to Guinea or Niger. As far as I was concerned, I was only doing any of this so I could get back to Niger at the time.
I see. So you had to do
And
that.
I had a sort of a very prejudicial perspective of Senegal, because Senegal's right on the coast. It gets all these American Peace Corps volunteers. You know, so people feel like they really know America, and they're used to, I don't know, their own sort of script. And I spoke already 3 languages from Niger. I learned another language while I was in Niger. I learned Jerma, which is like Songhai. So people kept coming up to me when I first went to Senegal and say, "Oh, do you speak Wolof?" And I would say, "I'm not a Peace Corps volunteer. I don't speak any Wolof." And then I would start speaking to them. I was terrible. I would start speaking to them in Songhai or Hausa.
Oh my God. So that's about how many? 6 languages now?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes.
6 languages. Pretty good.
So I don't know. I was kind of snobby. In retrospect, when I first got to Senegal. But then I got to appreciate Senegal and the culture there, the language. Yeah.
Have you written about these experiences? Did you keep diaries?
I am writing about it right now. I have a book in preparation. It's almost finished. And I just found an editor that I think is going to be important. So yeah, I'm trying to get some, not a lot of Senegal is in that book, but the stuff up to.
Sure. And then eventually you came back to the States? And then
Yeah, well, let's see, the job I had in Senegal was a subcontract to AID at the National Ag Research Institute. So I worked there for 4 years, I think. And then I didn't want to leave. So I took another job. I took a job with the National Council of Negro Women, had a West Africa office there. So I became the director of that office for 2 years. Then,
This is in DC?
no, in Dakar, in Senegal.
Oh.
And then I had some friends who were on Fulbright, some very dear friends. And the wife was the director of the West African Research Center there. And she said, you'd be perfect for the West African Research Center. You ought to try out for this job. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. So I did that for 5 years. So altogether, I was in Senegal almost 13 years. I came back to visit, and I had children. I got married again. And,
And how many children do you have?
altogether 3.
And now you are teaching?
Now I'm teaching at Lafayette College.
Lafayette College.
Yeah.
And was this after you finished with what you just described?
No, when I was in Dakar, I was recruited to Kent State University. If I had known more, I probably wouldn't have gone. Because I had been away from the United States so long, and I didn't know anything about Ohio. You know, we've been talking about how particular Washington, D.C. is. I got to Ohio, I was like, oh my God, where am I? It was so different. And growing up in the majority, and then getting to some place where the black people are the minority, and the dynamics are so different. And some of the whites are so dismissive. I'd never seen anything like it. And then some of the black people too, because of that environment, had a very insular community, very insular, very ingrown, because they had to rely on each other so much. So yeah, that was an education. I had some unpleasant experiences in Ohio, but I also met some wonderful people. I ended up being there for 8 years.
That's really the first time you experienced another America.
Yes, that is correct.
So that must have been a shock.
Oh, it was terrible, especially with 3 sons. 3 young black men, oh my goodness. I did get to go to Senegal while I was there. So I went to Senegal 3 times while I was in Ohio, and I took my kids, I think, once or twice while we were living in Ohio. But man, to really know what it's like to be the object of predatory behavior. Those police in Northeast Ohio are not a joke. They don't have anything to do. They're bored. There are a lot of little small towns. They're hunters. They enjoy it. They look for victims. They set people up. They frame people. The judges are part owners of the prisons. I'm telling you, that's another world. Yeah. That's another world.
Especially having lived in D.C.
Yes, exactly. I was like, I thought I understood America. I'm American. What happened? But I didn't really understand America. So my oldest son got framed while we lived he got locked up. While we were in Ohio, good old Ohio. I could see it coming. Framed.
Where were you?
Kent.
Okay. Oh, that's Kent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that just it's like playing a card game or something, And even some of the people who try to tell me, watch out, well, what could I do? I mean, I actually had one police guy, I think he felt really guilty. He said, you got to get your son. Like, where am I going to put him? So after that, I got busy and I got my middle son into a boarding school. Mm-hmm. But plus people were saying all kind of crazy things to them. They would get on the bus and the kids would say, hey, speak African to us. Speak African. And once my middle son came home and said, Mommy, why do people keep talking to me about fried chicken? It was wow. But I think it toughened everybody up. But wow, yeah. From the embassy of Mali to the courts of Kent, Ohio.
Well, and from the experience of the D.C. wonderful community.
Yeah. So, life has twists and turns.
What would you, I always ask this question, you've experienced an amazing life and at a juncture in American history that is very interesting too. What would you say to the younger generation of blacks?
I'm kind of a radical, and most people would not like what I have to say. And it doesn't work for everybody. I admit all these things. First is, see yourself as part of a bigger global African descendant community. It doesn't mean you have to do anything with them. It doesn't mean you're going to plan a movement. But it's healthier to compare like than unlike. If you're an orange, it's good to know what a tangerine is like. You don't have to go all the way to a pineapple or an apple. So unfortunately for African Americans, we're always comparing ourselves with white Americans. But we don't compare ourselves much with Jamaicans or Trinidadians or Brazilians. So we would know ourselves better. I think we would be happier if we knew more about some like communities. Not the same, but so that's the first thing. The second thing is we just have to stop letting white people be white. That's it. We're through with it. The game, it's boring. Nobody cares. The more we pay attention to whiteness, the more it continues to gather strength. And maybe there are different strategies we can come up with on an individual level and on a group level to say, well, you know, today's Thursday. I'm not letting anybody be white today. Sorry, as far as I'm concerned, your name is just Aaron and you're Aaron. That's it. You know, it's so necessary. And then just know history. I mean, African Americans have a terrible decision that we have to make in a way, which is almost like, to me, this is it's almost like self-annihilation. You can imagine that you're going to stay here and everybody's going to leave you alone and let you stay your black self, who you love so much and who is so wonderful. Except nowhere in history does that happen. Or you're going to have to decide to join the party. But you're going to have to decide, do you want to be, if you're going to be part of the America that crushed you, then you might as well you're some other kind of person. And I think it's very hard for Black Americans to separate out from being part of an imperial project, being part of the richest country on earth, being very special, having big refrigerators, having 8 different types of ketchup, with being black, you see, and that is a challenge for us because it also separates us from all the other black people in the world. And it's sort of our Achilles heel because we can't see it. It's so close to us. And it's normal because we are Americans, but at some point, and I do think this movement already exists, where some African Americans are questioning the system itself and the nature of wealth or happiness in the United States. But for African Americans, it's really something because if we can't have it both, you can't be like the biggest, baddest warrior of the Northern Industrial Complex and the poor black guy who don't have nothing. It's not gonna work. So that's a big contradiction. Yeah.
But for the blacks, it seems like you're saying, don't just be, it's sort of like don't be particularistic, meaning know the rest of the world that you're a part of.
Yes.
And I think that's very interesting because it, in a sense, it gets you out of.
Yes. But see, it really confronts what happened during slavery because the default is trust the white man. I might go do this and that, but I'm going to trust the white guys. But if you get to the point you can say, I wasn't going to listen to those Trinidadians. They might have something to tell me. I want to hear what that Mexican guy had to say. Then you become a human